Is your ABS light on? You may have a groaning noise on highway speed, or do you have a little bit of play from your wheel bearing? Well, I'm Rusty with FCP Euro, and today I'm gonna go over wheel bearing replacement on the G01 X3 M40i. On the table in front of me, we do have the new wheel bearing here, along with all the associated hardware we'll need to complete the job. As you can see, we've already gone ahead and replaced the driver's side, and we'll be going over the passenger side in today's repair. Now, as far as the service interval is concerned, there's not a general rule of thumb as to when you need to replace your wheel bearings. It is kind of a replace when worn symptom. You could be experiencing an ABS light, and that would maybe contributed to the tone ring on the back of the wheel bearing that may have warped, cracked, become disformed, causing the ABS light. You also could be experiencing a low growling sound coming from the front or rear of the vehicle, depending on which particular wheel bearing is bad. And furthermore, you may even have a loose feeling when having the vehicle on a lift and shaking it down, checking the suspension. That could be contributed to the actual hub being loose inside of the bearing. All right, and that pretty much takes care of everything on the table. Let's talk about some tools we'll need to do the job. Now, as far as tools are concerned, everything you see here on the table is a variation of what we're going to be using today. We have everything we need. However, we may omit a couple of things, but we have everything so you guys can be prepared. For starters, we're going to need a 1/2-inch impact gun. Otherwise, you can certainly use a breaker bar or something to get the wheel off, along with a 17mm. Tightening everything up, we're going to be using a 1/2-inch as well as a 3/8 torque wrench. Quite simply, you just need something that has a wide range, as a lot of the fasteners range from 8 Newton meters all the way up to 210 plus 90 degrees. So you're going to need something that has a wide variety of torque sequences. We've got a hammer here as well as a pry bar. You may want a little bit larger pry bar. And then we also have a little Brillo pad, but you can certainly use some sandpaper or a grinding wheel, a wheel hanger, as well as a caliper hanger. And then for sockets, we have an E16, a 10mm, a 6mm Allen. I've also got a 3/8 to 1/2-inch adapter, a T50 Torx, a T40 Torx. And then these may look like Torx bits, but they're actually called a TP60. TP meaning Torx Plus, which have a slightly more square edge, and as you can see on the Torx bits, they are a little bit more sharp, if you will. The TP60 is going to be very important in ensuring we do not strip out any of the wheel bearing bolts. We've also got a 17mm Allen, a 24mm socket, and a 21mm socket. Off to my left, a couple of wrenches you may want to have handy. We have a 21mm, a 24mm, and then we also have a 1/2-inch drive ratchet. And as always, it's going to be very handy to have a good flashlight around. And with that, let's get started. Now, with a 17mm and either an impact gun or a breaker bar still on the ground, and if you have a wheel lock key, we're going to go ahead and remove the wheel. Wheel lock key should be located in the trunk of the vehicle, and hopefully yours is there if you need it. Go ahead and put a wheel hanger in there and make it a little bit easier later on. Now that we've got the wheel off, one thing I do want to touch on, if you're doing the wheel bearing on the driver's side, you will have the brake wear sensor that'll lead out of the inner brake pad and go up to the box behind the strut. Do not try to take that out of the brake pad itself. You're better off just unplugging it from the box and kind of letting it hang. One more thing, if you don't have an impact gun and you want to go ahead and release that axle bolt, it's going to be very difficult while the entire rotor is spinning on you. So if you are just using hand tools and don't have an impact gun, pop the center cap out of your wheel, throw the wheel back on, bring the car back down, and break that loose. You could certainly do so with a screwdriver in the rotor, but with these nice fixed calipers, it's not exactly ideal. And if you want to check out a little bit more information on how to exactly do that, I went over that in our control arm replacement video. So that'll be linked in the description below, and we're going to move forward with removing this caliper. And before we go ahead and remove the caliper, if you do have any issues or you've actually had your brakes on for quite some time, you may have a little bit of a lip on the outside edge here. So one thing to keep in mind, you may want to just release a little bit of brake pressure by putting 2 pry bars in between the brake pads and just opening it up slightly. We just put new brakes on this car, so the pads aren't going to go back too far. However, releasing that pressure even just a little bit will make removal and installation of that caliper a lot easier. Go ahead and grab yourself something to hang the caliper, whether it's a coat hanger from your mother's closet, she's going to be pissed, I'm sure, or just an actual hanger here that we actually sell at fcpeuro.com. So go ahead and crack the E16 external Torx bolts loose. They're about 130 Newton meters, so they are going to be a little tight. However, we just had this off doing these front brakes, so these are a little bit looser than ones you'll have. Once you crack them loose, you should be able to release them by hand. And it sometimes helps to move the caliper a little bit to release the pressure and get the weight off of the threads. We have both of those out. We're going to leave all the pads and everything assembled inside of this caliper and just slide it out and away. Take our hanger and get that out of our way. So next thing we want to do is we want to get this rotor off. We do have a 6mm Allen in here. However, if you're using hand tools like we discussed, similar to the axle bolt, there are a couple of different ways you can go about this. You can certainly put a screwdriver inside of the caliper and break that free, or put 2 lug bolts back in here and using a pry bar to counter hold against that while you're trying to spin that. We did go over that in the brake video. However, I'm just going to use an impact gun and break this free real quick. And if this was torqued correctly, it shouldn't be too hard to release. It's only about 16 Newton meters. Ours, as you can see, is quite simply just falling off. You may need a hammer to release this from the hub, but again, we did just replace these brakes, so these are coming off quite simply. Now we want to go ahead and release this axle bolt. If your vehicle has a lot of miles on it and this is in a lot worse condition, you may have some rust in this area. Do a little bit of research before you get to this point. As I said before, if this does not release with an impact gun, you will have to reassemble everything, put the wheel back on with the center cap removed, and break it free on the ground. And if you're at this point, that would be really difficult and really frustrating to have to put the rotor, the caliper, everything back on and bring it back down. But as I said, we've already had this assembled recently, so I'm fairly certain that this impact gun will take this bolt right out. Once that bolt is out, your axle will be fairly loose. However, it will not be able to be released from behind the hub until the tie rod is released, as well as the lower control arm. Just for visual, we're going to take this dust shield off. It's not absolutely necessary. However, with the dust shield off, it's going to be a lot easier to torque the tie rod as well as the lower control arm that we're going to be removing to get the axle out. I'll let you guys decide what you want to do at home, but I do want to make mention that these 4 pieces of hardware here do have Loctite in them, so we probably should reapply that Loctite and clean out the threads when we go ahead and install that. We're going to get this off just so you guys can see all of this, but it can certainly be done without removing that dust shield. It does have about 4 10mm bolts around the outside here. All right, now we can see exactly what we need to remove. We're going to be taking off this tie rod end, and our particular one using the Mila tie rod ends does have a 21mm nut. And then we also have the lower control arm here that in order to get this bottom bolt from the bearing, all other 3 can be removed, but one stinking bolt can't be taken out without getting this control arm out. I know, it kind of sucks, doesn't it? So, and take a second here. If you have a vehicle that, again, has a lot of rust like we were discussing in the center here, you may want to use some penetrating oil on the outsides of the threads. As you can see, there are exposed threads here, so those could be susceptible to road grime, salt, and debris, and could start to deform those threads a little bit, making it difficult to remove those bolts. However, we've already done the driver's side. I wasn't concerned about that. There's not a lot of rust on this particular car. However, we've seen ones where it is definitely necessary to use some penetrating oil. So we do want to release the tie rod end, and there is a way to counter hold that if the impact gun doesn't release that nut all the way. And hopefully this impact gun will. However, we'll discuss that here in a second. Just like I said, it was able to release the initial bite of that hardware. However, we'll have to use a counter hold on here and basically holding the ball joint from spinning while releasing the nut. And this is another reason why taking this dust shield off is very helpful, because you won't have much ability to throw a wrench and counter hold that without that dust shield still in place. So get that dust shield off and you'll be able to counter hold this much easier. All right, with a 21 wrench, we're going to put that over the nut, and then a T40 on our particular tie rod will allow us to counter hold this. I don't recall if the factory tie rod is the same, so don't quote me on that if you have factory tie rods installed. So you may have to manipulate the ball joint end a little bit to get it to come out all the way. Once we get that out, we should be able to squeeze that axle out of here. Now that we've got that tie rod out, you're still unable to get the axle out without releasing the lower thrust arm. We're going to try to release it from the outer ball joint here. We don't want to release it from the inner portion on the subframe. That is actually set at ride height, and we went over that in depth on the control arm video. So if we get this out here, we should be good to get that axle out of the way and start working on the actual wheel bearing hardware. So similar to the tie rod end, this does have the ability to counter hold in here, and you may actually experience a point where you get that nut all the way off. You don't have to counter hold it. However, the ball joint is technically seized into the knuckle. We did go over this in our G20 video, so Check out the G20 front control arm video where a good friend Mike of ours has actually struggled quite a bit to get these control arms out. Using a series of pickle forks and air hammers and things of that nature, you may find yourself spending a lot more time on this specific ball joint than we will here, so keep that in mind. With a 24mm and an impact gun, this should release quite easily. If you're doing this on jack stands on the driveway, this part may be rather difficult. You're going to want to have the car up in the air, or at least have the ability to have some leverage or a third hand. So maybe grab your good friend and have him hold the knuckle out of the way for you. What we're going to be doing is pulling the knuckle outward, meaning the tie rod, whether you're working on the driver's side or the passenger side, the tie rod end is going to be pointing out towards the car. So with the caliper out of the way, we'll get the knuckle spun a little bit here. This control arm is still stuck in here. We're gonna try to work that out. You can see the control arm starting to come out there, but our axle is technically still in our way. So when the ball joint starts to kind of point out, at this point, we're able to get our axle out of here. You may have to compress the outer axle joint at the same time as removing it from the knuckle, and then also pushing up on the control arm at the same time to try to release them all at the same time. So we got our axle out of the way. Got the ball joint kind of fighting us here. There we go. Control arms down and out of the way. Axle's up here. Ideally, it'd be nice to do this entire knuckle and bearing on the bench. However, we're trying to show you the exact way to do it without releasing as many parts as possible. So I'm going to grab something to kind of hold this axle out of the way. All right. I know it doesn't look like the axle's much out of the way. However, we don't want it resting on the control arm. We want to be able to gain access to all the lower hardware points down here. We may have to drop the axle out of this little rope that I have here and drop it back down on the control arm just to crack loose these two top ones. However, we'll work on these bottom bolts first, making sure they loosen up, and then we'll move on to the top with the axle out of the way. All right, if you remember from the tool section of this video earlier on, we did have two separate tools present on the table. The TP60 that is used to hold these bearings in is very important. If you use a regular Torx 60, you're more than likely going to round out the fastener in the bearing, and then actually removing that bearing is going to be a nightmare. If that gets stripped, you're really up you know what's creek without a paddle. So there are two different lengths to these tools we have here. It's really going to depend on what you have available and how much leverage you have, because with the longer tool you are going to reduce your leverage slightly, and it may increase the amount of twisting that can happen. But if you look behind the hub here, the bolts are rather recessed, so if you are going to go with the shorter one, you may need a short extension. And if you go with the longer one, it will put that just outside of the knuckle, giving you enough clearance to swing down past the outside of the knuckle, and making sure that you have that TP60, not a Torx 60. So with a 1/2-inch breaker bar or a 1/2-inch ratchet, we'll go ahead and release those two lower pieces of hardware. You can certainly release these with an impact gun. However, you do run the risk of stripping that hardware if it's not all the way seated. We do understand that not everyone's going to have this amount of leverage, and an impact gun would certainly get the job done. However, you really want to be careful you get that bolt seated in there. As I said, if you strip one of these bolts out, it's going to be a little bit of a hard time. Go up to the top fastener here now, releasing this one, and I might be able to just barely get in that top one. Now that we've got three of those released, this axle's a little bit in our way, so I'm just going to drop this down, go in from the front here. All right, now we've got all those released. These should come out pretty good, but if you are living in a rusty climate, or you're watching this video 10 years from now, these pieces of hardware may not be in the same condition. So you will want to keep in mind a little bit of penetrating oil goes a long way. You may even want to soak these the night before, because it will make your life a lot easier if these are seized in there. So hopefully the editors will speed through this. I'm going to take these out by hand, and the wheel bearing will pretty much fall out. All right, and that's the last bolt. I understand again that your hub may not come out this easy, because once ours is released, it literally just fell out. As these vehicles begin to age, we do have a little bit of dissimilar metals, this being steel, knuckle being aluminum. This may actually seize into place. So a couple of things you may want to keep in mind. You may actually have to use a hammer to get this thing out. You really want to be careful not to damage the knuckle, because any damage to the inside of here will make the seat of this sit differently and could alter the torque and create some unwanted alignment issues, noises, what have you. So if you actually have an instance where this is seized in the hub, my suggestion to you would be to thread in one of these bolts from inside the hub while it's still in there, using a punch or an air hammer, get into the center of that bolt and try to hit the center of the bolt on either corner, walking this out individually. You can certainly have the hub in here, get a screwdriver under here and try to work it out that way. However, using the bolts to get that out is definitely going to be a little bit more safe. You really want to make sure that you keep this knuckle in good shape, because any deformities to this is going to cause issues. So with that, let's go ahead and clean up this mating surface and we'll catch you guys in a second. All right, with either some brake cleaner or some compressed air, we want to try to get as much of the brake dust and debris out of here. Anything that's stuck to that ABS sensor could cause a erroneous reading, so we really don't want to get as much of this debris out of here before we install that new wheel bearing. All right, that's clean enough for now. We're gonna go ahead and clean up the sealing surface. You can see there's a little bit of rust built up on the sides here. We're just gonna knock that down with some Brillo pad. If it's a little bit more aggressive, you may wanna use a sanding disc or something that'll remove that rust a little bit further. However, you don't wanna dig into the metal of the wheel bearing housing too much, because any discrepancy in here could cause a little camber or excessive toe in a extreme situation. But we just want to nick off a little bit of that rust on the edges here just to knock that down and give the wheel bearing a good sealing surface there. All right, now that we're ready to go ahead and install our wheel bearing, grab one of the bearings, no difference side to side. However, there is a little bit of symmetry from top to bottom. So we will want to put the two bolts that are a little bit closer to each other, other than the bottom, which are a little bit further apart. It will not bolt up the other way, so you'll find that out one way or the other. And then grab a couple of the wheel bearing bolts and start hand tightening them in. And you may want to grab a pen and paper or get ready to do a screenshot, because the torque sequence that's going to be coming up for this wheel bearing is a little confusing, but certainly doable. So as I said before, first step is 20 Newton meters on all four. And just to make sure that it all gets tightened down evenly, do it in a little bit of a diagonal pattern. So we'll start on this outer bottom one here and we'll go to the further back corner one, just walking everything down evenly throughout. Well, a little bit too much, but that's okay. We're gonna go back and give it 140 anyway. 3 Newton meters over. All right, now we wanna go back and do all four of those to 140 Newton meters. And we'll switch over to the longer one, because the top ones, as you can see, are slightly recessed in this housing, which is why the longer one is gonna be much helpful. Much easier to get the swing of the ratchet rather than that short one where you can only come from underneath the knuckle. All right, grab yourself a little pen marker or just eyeball it, but we want to make sure we do not exceed the 45 degree when we back these bolts off. So put a mark at the 12 o'clock point and the 3 o'clock point, and mark the bolt at the 3 o'clock point so you can kind of watch the bolt not exceed that 45 degree. That's about 45. All right, I'm gonna go through and do 120 Newton meters on all four in that diagonal pattern again as well. And then we'll clean up all of our marks that we've made. Now we're ready to do our 90. If you do not have a tech angle torque wrench, you can certainly do something similar to what we did when we were doing the 45 degree back off and just mark the bolts and do a full 90 degree. Or you could just kind of eyeball your wrench and do a full turn. Although, as you can see, I'm probably gonna have to do 245 degrees here because there's not enough room to swing this ratchet in here. So, all right, now we'll put a final little torque mark on the bolts. Do want to take a second to mention that you'll notice I had my hand on the back of that ratchet. I was applying quite a lot of torque, and it is twisting because of the length of the TP60 that we have there. So you really want to be very, very certain that you have that tool securely pressed into that bolt, because at this point, if you're putting that much torque on that to tighten it and you strip it, again, it's going to be a very hard time to get that out and replace that. So just make sure you take the time to get that secured and you're not rushing through that. Now that we have the wheel bearing torque to the hub, we are going to have to do a little dance of fitting the axle in with the control arm kind of at the same time. If you remember from earlier in the video, it was a bit of pulling the knuckle out, pushing the axle out all at the same time. So bear with me. I'm probably going to be right in front of this, so hopefully you guys can see most of what's going on here. But we got the axle up out of the way. I'm going to grab the ball joint and tip in the bottom ball joint and try to get that lined up. And before that gets entirely seated, trying to get the axle compressed towards the body of the car. Watching out for that ABS harness right there. There we go. All right, so a little bit of a dance. You may have to play around with it a little bit, but you just got to get the ball joint just barely into that knuckle, and then you'll be able to sneak the axle in behind there, get it all in together. So we've got a new ball joint nut and a new tie rod end nut. And then we also have that funky axle design. So you're gonna kind of want to use two hands and get them seated firmly, because as you saw earlier, those splines on the end of the axle do need to mate the backside of the bearing. So we're gonna try to get this, making sure that when you're spinning the bearing back and forth, it is also spinning the axle. If you're spinning the bearing and the axle kind of stays still in your hand on the backside, you haven't fully engaged the splines on that face of the axle. So keep that in mind. Get your axle bolt here. You can also see in the center here how centered the axle is to the hub. So just a couple of reference points to make sure that you get those teeth fully engaged. It is a little bit of an odd design. Use your 17 millimeter and again, sink this down, making sure you have full contact of those teeth as you're walking this in. You get close, give it a wiggle, and just really ensure that that spring is keeping tension on that. There we go. That's how that should look. You don't want any play in between those, and then you know that the splines are pretty much on the outside of each other. So now everything's roughly fitted. We can go ahead and torque all of those before we put the dust shield back on. With the dust shield off, it's going to give us plenty of access to these pieces of hardware here. We're going to start with the outer tie rod end, which is 165 Newton meters. And if you recall from earlier, it was a 21 millimeter. All right, similar to the tie rod that has the T40 for counter holding. If you have difficulty getting this one tight, there is a T50 in the bottom of that. However, you can certainly hang on the thrust arm to put a little bit of pressure into the knuckle, and we're going to use the impact gun just to start this before we give it that 100 Newton meter torque. Now we need to do a final 90 degree. All right, now before we put our rotor on, we want to throw our dust shield back on. Take the time to clean out the Loctite that was on the threads in here. Generally, we should probably replace these pieces of hardware. However, they're small M6 pieces of hardware, and I believe the only reason they want us to replace it is because there is thread lock that BMW installs on the hardware when it is shipped. So we're just going to apply a little bit of Loctite and go ahead and install those. With a 10 millimeter, we're going to torque these all to 8 Newton meters. All right, so we still need to torque the axle bolt when we get the vehicle down on the ground. That's going to be 210 Newton meters plus 90, and we're really not going to be able to counter hold this, so we want the whole vehicle down on the ground, and that weight of the car will hold the wheel from spinning. So let's go ahead and grab the rotor. If you are using a used rotor and the rotor has a little bit of debris on the backside of it, you really want to clean it up similar to how a new hub will be. You want to make sure that backside of the rotor surface is like new, doesn't have any rust built up. And you want to make sure it seats on this hub evenly, not creating any pulsation when applying the brakes. But we've just installed new brakes, so we don't need to take the time to clean that up. I just wanted to take a second to let you guys know that at home. We have our rotor screw as well, and we're going to be torquing the 6 millimeter Allen in the rotor screw to 16 Newton meters. All right, we are now ready to hang our caliper. So take your caliper down from your hanger here and don't leave the hanger up there. And if you have not already, go ahead and take a second to push your pads back just slightly so that the caliper can kind of slide over the rotor like so. We've got our new hardware for the caliper, the external 16 Torx bolts. These fitted, and then we're going to snug them all the way up. 1/2 inch torque wrench to 130 Newton meters. All right. Well, we do still need to reinsert our brake hose that I may have taken off on camera. I don't know if I showed you guys this, but there is a little provision back here that we released to give ourselves a little bit more room on the caliper. So if you did disengage that, go ahead and fit that back in. And before you put your wheel on, don't forget to take the center cap out so we can gain access to that 17 millimeter for the axle bolt. All right. Now that we've got the wheels snugged up, we'll bring the car back down, torque the wheels to 140 Newton meters. Rid of our wheel lock key. Now I'm going to switch over to another torque wrench and finish up the 17 millimeter for the axle bolt to 210 plus 90. Don't forget your center cap. All right, and that pretty much wraps up today's DIY on the front wheel bearings on your G01 X3 M40i. I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. If so, don't forget to hit that like button. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, get down in the comment section down below. We'll have plenty more videos on this vehicle and many others like it, so don't forget to subscribe. Thank you guys so much for watching. We'll catch you on the next one.